We're on the top of Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis. Yesh Mehem Poter Avalos. With regard to Chol Moed, in some cases, even if he violates Malach on Chol Moed, Tirch on Chol Moed, nevertheless he's not punished. Yesh Mehem Muter Lechatchila. In certain cases, we allow him to do Malacha Lechatchila, and that would be for Davar Avid, the Tzarch HaMoed. We added other elements into the equation like Shinui and Chutz L'Tchum, or perhaps cases where he's doing it as a Maisa Hejot. Rav Huna Chatztule Chatzada b'Moed. On Chol Moed, the workers, presumably non-Jewish workers, reaped the harvest of Rav Huna. I see Esfei Rabba bar Rav Huna. So Rav Huna's son asked him the following question. Tochanin, we have a brisa that allows grinding kemach, grains, and making flour, b'moed l'tzorach hamoed, v'shalo l'tzorach hamoed, also. And if it's not for the purpose of baking bread on the moed, then it's also. And we're talking about a malacha of katisha, of actually tchina and pounding down the flour, the grinding of the flour, of the grains to make flour. And if he does malacha on Chol Moed, if it's tzarchei moed, then generally speaking, there's an absolute heter, carte blanche. And that means he's allowed to prepare even generously, way beyond what he needs, and he doesn't have to measure it out. However, in certain cases of Chol Moed work, as we said before, they have to be done in private. And in the case of L'tzarch HaMoed, it could be done even in public. Davar she'avud b'moed, mutar asoso b'moed. If he's going to suffer financial loss, we're going to allow him to implement that malacha during Chol Moed, even if it's not L'tzarch HaMoed. Davar she'eino avud b'moed, if something is not going to cause a loss, and it's not L'tzarch HaMoed, then it's us. However, this heter of davar avud applies to something that is metaltalin, and it's movable, it's detached from the ground, but that which is a crop that's growing from the ground, even if it will take a loss, he is enjoined from doing that work on Chol Moed. And we're talking about crop that is standing in the fields, it's attached to the ground, and it needs processing. And this harvest is called public in nature. However, v'im ein lo ma yochal, if he really has no food to put on the table, then he's allowed to do all the malachas that are necessary. Kotzer, ma'amer, dash, zora, bora, betochen. Ubilvad shelo yodush b'paros. We're not going to allow him to do the threshing with oxen. Now, when it says, im ein lo ma'yocha, we don't have to take that literally, as if to say he's dying, so it's a pikuach nefesh situation, he has no other option. He has an option of borrowing food, buying food. It's not required to do so. He can prepare the food on his own. In any event, we see from the brisa that in general, implementing malacha in the case of mechuber lekarka is prohibited, even when it's a davar avud, unless he has nothing to eat, ein lo mayochal. And therefore the kasha is, and this is what Rabbah was asking his father Rav Huna, how could Rav Huna allow for the workers to harvest mechubel karka? We said in mechubel karka, then the only heter that we can give you in the case of mechubel karka is a case where ein lo ma yochel. Rav Huna, responds to Rabbah bar Rav Huna, Yichidahi, the brisa that expresses this chumrah with regard to mechubel karka and prohibits malacha like tzira, etc., mechubel karka, unless it's ein lo ma yochel. That's a dissenting view and represents a minority opinion. It's not the majority opinion. We have not accepted that minority opinion. It's been rejected from halacha. It's a chumrah, but it's not normative halacha. Desanya, we learned in the brisa. Klal Omar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Mishum Rabbi Yossi Dover Atolish Min HaKarka Afilu Mikzaso Avud Mutter Hamachubel HaKarka Afilu Kulo Avud Asur. Now, this is a single dissenting view quoted in the name of Rabbi Yossi, that if it's something that's mechubel karka, even though it's kulo avud, we can only allow the malachos that start with ktsira and with china if it's ein lo ma sheyochel. That's a minority view. Says Rav Huna, I accept la halacha, the majority view. And that would mean that even in mechubel karka, if it's a davar avud, then it's mutter. So the Gemara asks the following: Rabbi Yossi, in the previous brisa, if it was authored by Rabbi Yossi, so why would he permit, in any case, even threshing in the case where he uses oxen? Is, according to Rabbi Yossi, someone who has nothing to eat, he's allowed to thresh with oxen, Yodesh Nami B'Paros. So you're telling me that Rabbi Yossi has a minority opinion, and the time of the first brisa is Rabbi Yossi, so then why can't he thresh with paros, with oxen, if it's a davar avud, and he has nothing to eat? It's ein lo ma yochel. And ha'amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, to support this question, we're going to quote a statement of Rabbi Yitzchak that man tana shinu b'moed b'davar avud deloka Rabbi Yossi. That's what we saw. Rabbi Yitzchak said earlier that when do we require shinui on Moed? In a case of davar avud, that's only according to one opinion, but it's the loka Rabbi Yossi. It's against Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi would certainly allow you to do a malachi kedarka if it's a davar avud. And the reason why the brisa prohibits threshing with oxen is because work performed on Chol Moed must be performed in an irregular way. And that's against Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi holds that once there's a heter to do the malacha on Chol Moed, for example, it's a davar avud, then you don't require any sort of shinui whatsoever. Do it in the regular, normal manner. Rav Huna would answer this question, Hachinami, here too, in the case of threshing with oxen, when Rabbi Yossi spoke about introducing a shinui into the malacha, he doesn't mean that you need the shinui for that particular point of his psak. Even the chal yom alav b'paras aishi, In fact, even during the regular course of the year, they don't necessarily use oxen to achieve the disha. So what are you telling me? You're telling me that oxen cannot be used on Chol Moed. It must be for a different reason entirely. It's not because of Shinui, because even if you leave out the oxen, it still is lav Shinui. It's not irregular. So therefore, the Gemara concludes now that the reason why the Brisa prohibits using oxen on Chol Moed is not because we need a Shinui in a case of Davar Ovid, but rather because of Avsha Milsa. Means it creates a commotion. We don't want to publicize the fact that we are performing Beheter Malacha on Chol Moed. We want it to be very much Bitsina. So in other words, the Gemara's conclusion now is that the Brisa could reflect the Shita Rabbi Yossi, and the reason why Rabbi Yossi and the Brisa prohibits the use of oxen is not because of Shinui, but simply to avoid creating this commotion, this loud noise. Tana Rabbanu, we learned to the Brisa. Tochanin b'moed l'tzarech hamoed. If you want to grind up flour, wheat or other grains to make flour and Chol Moed, you're allowed to do it with Tzarech HaMoed. Shalol Tzarech HaMoed also. But now what happens if he went ahead and he grinded grains on Chol Moed for the Yontif, but he left over, there was leftover. What's the status of the leftover? And the Gemara answers, Hareze Mutter. So he's got leftover from the volume of grains that he made into flour, that he ground, and that leftover is mutter. We're not going to penalize him and say that because he was tochen the hosir, he went out of his way with an extra tchina, therefore we're going to penalize him and he's not allowed to enjoy the benefit of that extra tchina. Now he quotes here in the note a ritva about im tochan v'hosir harezim mutter. What does that mean? That one need not be exacting in his performance of tzarchei hamoed. He may prepare generously and some will be left over. That's fine, it doesn't matter. Kotzitzin eitzim b'moed l'tzarch hamoed. So you're allowed to cut down branches on Chol Moed to use them as fuel. Shalol l'tzarch hamoed also. So it's not, if it's not needed on the yontif, then it's also. But v'im katzas v'hosir harezem mutter. So this would support our position mentioned earlier that if you have surplus that's left over, it's mutter. Matilin shecher b'moed l'tzarch hamoed. So talk about preparing beer, brewing beer on Chol Moed for the Moed. And that's mutter matilin, but shalol l'tzarch hamoed also. The im hitil v'hosir, like the case that we had before, in the case of grains, now we have it in the case of beer. Reizem mutter. Okay. So what he did was beheter. He has leftover beer, and he's allowed to use it. There's no iser that's imposed as a result of the violation of Chol Hamoed. So hitil v'hosir harezem mutter u'bilvad shelo yarin. According to this particular Tana, in this particular brisa, you're not allowed to be married. You're not allowed to say, well, oh, I'm going to use all this beer for my family or my guests and so forth and so on, and that's Baba Maisa. That's not true. That you can't do. You can't prepare beer deliberately more than what you need for Yontif under the pretext that you're going to need it all. So the Gemara is going to try to prove that there is another sheet amongst Tanoim that allow for Harama, and it's all a machlokas Tanoim. Ureminu, my pilin, shecher b'moed l'tzorch hamoed, v'shol l'tzorch hamoed ha'osur, echad shecher t'morim, echad shecher siorim, v'afal pi sheyesh lo yoshan, marim, v'shosem in achadash. So according to this brisa, one is permitted to employ harama on Chol Hamoed. Because it says here, Afal Pisha Yeshlo Yachan, he has sufficient beer in stock for Yontif, but he gives a pretext that he needs more for Yontif. And according to this brisa, Mari v'shosam in achadash, he's allowed to implement a harama. And he's going to drink a little bit of this new shosam in achadash, of this new beer that was brewed. Now, how do we reconcile this brisa with the first brisa that prohibits work when it's performed on the harama? And the Gemara answers Tanoi, this is indeed a machlokas Tanoi, the Sanyu into the brisa, ein marim v'kach. We do not allow using subterfuge, harama, in this manner. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda marim. We're allowed to do this harama. And the first brisa follows the Tanakama of this brisa. The second follows Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. So 1 second. Rav Chatzule Chatzada Dechuya Demoed. On Chol Hamoed, they reaped his harvest. Shabbat Shmuel ve'ikvid. Shmuel objected to allow reaping someone's harvest on Chol Hamoed. Lema Shmuel ki yechidas virale. Is he alone in his opinion? Because he's objecting to what seems to be based on Rabbi Yossi. He seems to be raising an objection based on Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi was the one who was Mekil, and it seems that Shmuel is Machmir. Again, we're talking about Mechuber L'Karka. So Shmuel now seems to be following the opinion of one individual Tana. The Gemara says, "Lo, Shmuel cannot be reconciled with Rav Yossi. Chatzada the chite hava v'lo kavi pas." Chatzada, we're talking about wheat harvest, which would not have been lost if it was left unattended after the hunt. So there was no need, no pressing need to harvest it on Kol Moed, and that's why Shmuel objects. So Gemara asks immediately, "V'Rav my time of it." Why did Rav allow this? If the crop was no longer in danger, the Gemara answers, "Ein lo ma yochal hava." In truth, Rav was in the position of poverty. He didn't have anything to eat. He was permitted to harvest his wheat on Chol Moed. Ushmuel lo simua kameh. And as far as Shmuel is concerned, they had not explained Rav's situation to him. He was unaware that Rav was so poor that he didn't have enough food to last for the next meal. Well, had Shmuel known about this, he never would have objected. Inami, alternatively, Shmuel knew that Rav was about to terminate his. Shmuel knew that Rav was so poor that he would terminate any objection to his doing malach and Chol Moed. So nobody had explained Rav's situation of being ein lo ma lo lechol to Shmuel. Shmuel never got that word. Inami, a third possibility. Shmuel knew of Rav's situation, but he objected because Adam chashiv shaydim. An Adam chashiv has to hold himself to a stricter standard. Shmuel felt that although regular rank and file people have been permitted to reap the grain, Rav should not have done so. Because Adam chashiv shiny. So what do you do with this Adam chashiv? I mean, he's not going to die of starvation. Ella, we're going to allow him to buy grains from those who have. Rav Yehuda Nisia Nafik B'chumrata Dimidosha. And this is based on a Gemara in Masechet Shabbos. Rav Yehuda Nisia, wore a ring made of metal with a signet of wood, called Madosh wood. The Ishte Maya di Achem Klipa Arma. So as far as Shabbos is concerned, he went out in the courtyard on Shabbos wearing the ring. And during the weekdays, he drank water, the Ashti Maya, the Achem Kapela Armanosa. The water was heated by an Armenian, a non-Jew, obviously. And yet, Shamar of Ami Ikpid. Oh, Rav Yosef, my time at Ikpid, why was Rav Ami so upset? Why did he object so seriously? Imishum Chumrasa Dividosha. If it's because of the signet ring, and it's forbidden to wear it on Shabbos, and it's mukta hatanya, we learned in a brisa. Hashirayim hanizomim hatavos hareim techol hakelim hanitolim b'chatzah. So, like anything that's asur in tiltal of kalim is allowed to be moved within a courtyard, in a chatzah. Now, these articles cannot be worn on Shabbos. None of them. They'll have to be moved about for various purposes. So swinging around to Rav Yehuda Nasia's ring, its use is forbidden, but he's allowed to move it for the sake of its use. That's called Tarkufo, or its place, L'tzorch Makoma. So when Rav Yosef wore this ring, that would not have been the cause of Rabbi Ami's objection. If it's because he drank water, the achem kapela arma'a, so the water was heated up by an Armenian cook, and there's an Isur Bishal Akum, Ha Omar Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Amarav, Kol Shenechal Kemos Chuchai, Einbo Mishum Bishal Nachrim. So water can be drunk chai, you don't have to cook it, and therefore the cooking doesn't generate Isur Bishal Akum. So then again, we're trying to figure out the cause of Rabbi Ami's objection. So the Gemara answers, Adam Choshev Shaini. As we said earlier, a strict standard is required for a significant person, a man of stature, a prominent person. Ordinary people are going to go out on Shabbos with a signet ring and with dry water heated by a Gentile. Rabbi Yehuda Nasia should not have done so. Amar Rav Chananel, Amar Rav, Kotetz Adam Dekel B'Moed. You're allowed to cut down a date palm, a palm tree on Chol Moed. Afal pi she'eino tzarich el nesara shalom. He doesn't need the whole tree with all its fruit. He needs the sawdust. And the only way you can get this minimum measure of sawdust is only if he cuts down the tree. And although this tirchi is seira, and he's going to get a small benefit from it, it's allowed because it's Sarchei HaMoed. His light Abai. Abai was unhappy with this, and he cursed anyone who would follow this reasoning that you're allowed to chop down a tree in order to obtain a little bit of sawdust on Chol Moed. Rav Ashi Havile Abba Bishlaina. So Rav Ashi was the proud owner of a forest in an area called Shalanya. Also, Lemikse Bechula de Moed, on Chol Moed, he went to cut down some of the trees. Amalei Rav Shila Mishalna le Rav Ashi, my daitach. Why do you think that you're allowed to do this? Omar Rav Chananel, Omar Rav. I can assume it's because Rav Chananel said in the name of Rav, Kotet Adam Dekel b'Moed, Afal Pichein Torchel in Nesara Shalom. But that's not enough to justify your actions, Rav Ashi. Holayit Allah Abayit. Abai cursed anyone who follows that rule. Omalei. So Rav Ashi says to Rav Shilo, Lo Shmieli. I never heard about Abai's ruling. Klomar lo svirle. The Gemara interprets that to mean that I disagree, and I have a right to paskin against Abai. Ishtamit narga boy lemifseke l'shake. So Rav Ashi began chopping the trees. The axe slipped and almost severed his thigh. And this was punishment for transgressing Abaye's ruling. Shavke v'hadarasa. At that point, Rav Ashi threw his hands up in the air, and he understood, he realized that this was a fulfillment of the curse. And Hadar Asa, he left the forest and he returned home. Abai felt that it was highly improper for one to expend so much effort on Chol Moed for so minuscule of a gain. Alternatively, Abai objected because the main product of this work, of all this, the ircha, is the tree's wood, and not for tzarchei moed. Rabbi Yehuda Sharol in the Ekar Kitana. See, I'm not so sure I understand Rav Ashi here, because we don't usually read Simonim and change the Psak Halacha because of ominous things that happen. It's Lo Nachash B'Yakov. I'm not sure exactly. In Halacha, I guess it's a little different. In any event, Rabbi Yehuda permitted uprooting flax, ulemiktel shusa, and to cut the hops, leme'eker shumchame, to uproot shumcham plants. All this he permitted during Chol Moed. Amalei Abai Rav Yosef, Bishlema Kisna. I understand that what he's doing by uprooting flax is l'tzarech hamoed because chazi lechafifa. You can use it for covering food. Shusa chazi l'shikra. And cutting down hops, which are fit for brewing beer. And this he was matir because of tzarchei hamoed. El shum shvei l'may chazi. Okay, explain to me, Kisna, you came to Shutza, but what are we going to do with Shumshimeh? Shumshimeh are seeds that cannot be eaten until they have dried. Obviously, therefore, they have no use on the same day they were harvested, namely on Chol Moed. And the Gemara answers, Chazi linanze de ispahu. So they are fit for immediate use on account of the withered seeds they contain that can be used immediately on Moed. So the bulk of chumchumin seeds cannot be used right away. But there are smaller, more delicate ones that become dry and withered while the plants are still attached to the ground, and they're ready for immediate use upon harvesting. Rav Yanai Havileahu Pardisa, he had an orchard, the Mota Zimne Bechula de Moad. Or the time for harvesting coincided with Chol Moed Katve. He realized it was a davar avlud, and he would lose the fruits if he didn't pluck them and pick them out immediately from the trees. And the spectators thought that this was a general permission to harvest fruits on Chol Moed. Lashana shihuya kuli alma lepardisi. Next year, everyone deliberately postponed, lahashos is to postpone their harvesting. L'chol Moed, they didn't harvest their orchards until Chol Moed, and that's awesome. So inadvertently, Rav Yanai's public action, although it was mutter, caused the less knowledgeable people to transgress the Torah and violate Chol Moed. Afkare Rav Yanai lepardisa luchat. In order to do tshuva and achieve kapara, he abandoned his orchard to the poor for that year. In other words, he took absolutely no benefit from it. This leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Beis. Machnis Adam Peirosim B'nei Ganovim on Chol Moed. He's going to allow to take his fruits into the house for security purposes, in order that they should not be stolen by the thieves. And normally, a person is prohibited from gathering fruits from his garden or from his orchard and bring them in his house during Chol Moed, even though it's not a malacha per se, but it is a tircha. But here, where there's a danger that the thieves will abscond with his fruits, he's permitted to bring them in. And that's called a davar. B'shole pishtanu min hamishra, he's allowed to lift up his flax that's soaking in the mishra b'shvil shalo tovek, so that it shouldn't get destroyed. Because to separate the fibers of the flax from its woody tissue, one soaks it, but if it's not removed in time, it becomes spoiled. He should not deliberately schedule his work for Chol Moed. So if he can perform the task before Chol Moed or after Yom Tov, then he should not deliberately schedule this malacha for Chol Moed. Even though for him it's convenient, that's when he has free time. V'kulonim kivnu malachton b'moed yovdu. We're going to penalize those who deliberately scheduled work for Chol Moed, and they will not be allowed to enjoy the fruit of their labor. So it means that the owner is forbidden from that work that was illegitimate, that was a violation of the Torah law. And again, this penalty only applies to a mazid who deliberately schedules his work for Chol Moed. If he forgot to perform the work, then he's not penalized. He's only a shogeg. Hana, we learned in a brayso, when are we permitted to gather the fruits in the house because of the thieves? That's only if no one's going to see him. If he'll do it bitzina, in private. Otherwise, the onlooker thinks he's allowed. You're allowed to gather fruits in from the fields into your house. Rav Yosef Havilek Shur, he had beams, large, heavy beams. Ailinu biyamama. He brought them into his house on Chol Moed during the daytime. You got to do it in the cover of night, in private. Why did you bring the beams by daylight, in broad daylight? Everyone could see it. Amar Le Rav Yosef said, Sina dahani yamamahu, which literally means the privacy of these is obtained during daytime also. Why? Came into Malayla, Bo, Gavra, Yiseri. At night, they need additional men. Uboy, Midochre, Denura, and torches of fire are needed. Is therefore Avsha Milsa. It creates a whole commotion. It's not really private at night. So that bringing his beams in at night is not more private than bringing into the day, by day. And therefore one perform this task either by day or at night. The Mishnah says, Shola Pishtanim in a Mishra, Boy Mine Rabbi Yirmiyah mi Rabbi Zera, Kivein Malachta B'moed Umes Mau. If a person scheduled his work for Chol Moed deliberately, then he performed it, and then he died, should we penalize his surviving sons, requiring them to forfeit the fruits that were a result of illegal labor? Or shall we say the penalty only should be implemented on the father, but it shouldn't affect and be extended to the sons? So the Gemara now gives us a case in which a father's penalty are levied against his surviving sons. Imtim Salomar, and here we'll turn to the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Saram Ozen Bechor. Somebody nicked the ear of a firstborn kosher animal, and he died. Konsu Beno Achrav. They penalized his surviving son. But Bishum Disur Doraisa, that's because blemishing a Bechar that has Kedushas Bechar is a violation of a Doraisa. The Imtim Salomar Mochar Avdol Yovi Kachamumes, and even if you'll find that in the case of one who sold his slave to an idolater and died, Kansu Banav Achrov, and there we do impose a penalty on the sons because the iniquity, the violation of the father, Mishum de Kol Yoma Mafkile Mi Mitzvos. Every day, the son leaves the slave with the idolater. The slave is removed from the observance of commandments. So that even though the son did not perform the act of selling, we penalize him so that the son will be encouraged to redeem the slave. And Hachamai, what about in our case? What's the din? Gavra Konis Rabbanon. Was it the man that the Rabbanon penalized? For Lessa, that man is no longer here. Odilma Mamona Konis Rabbanon. The Rabbanon only assumed, or shall we say, only instituted a penalty. But Isa, and the money is there. It's in the hands of the surviving son. So perhaps they decreed that whether or not the owner is still alive, any obtained money illicitly, meaning illegally, should be confiscated, should be forfeited. And we're going to pick this up in Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow, which is Tuesday. And how many lines down are we from the top? Just to make a note of it. Omalei, it should be right here to Nisua. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down from the top. Okay, then. Have a good day. Thank you.